In 1980, a family of 3 disappeared. Though 2 would later be found murdered, it took 40 years to solve what happened to the 3rd. But as often happens in unsolved cases, one answer just leads to more questions, but in this case, it also leads to a very important thing: hope. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome to the 12 Days of Crimelines and our 12 daily episodes, which are my gift to all of you for your support of the podcast over the last year. Every time you listen, it helps the show keep going, and it really is about every single person who hits play on an episode. So I really do appreciate everyone who wants more Crimelines and more of the content I produce, and the way I say thank you is by producing more content. This case was recommended by a listener, Rachel, and it reminds me a little of the Lisa and Tiffany Stacy case. So let's go ahead and get started with Harold Clouse, who went by his middle name Dean, and Tina Lynn. The 2 lived in New Smyrna Beach, Florida in the late 1970s, and they met through their siblings. Tina's brother was dating Dean's sister. At the time they met, Tina was 15 and Dean was 19, and within a year of dating, the 2 found out that Tina was pregnant. And in spite of their very young ages, they decided to have a quick courthouse wedding in June of 1979. They lived with Tina's sister for a while, and their daughter, Holly Marie, was born on January 24th, 1980. With the hope of better job opportunities, the young family moved to Lewisville, Texas. They had so little at that time that they had to borrow Dean's mother's car just to make the move, and they lived with Dean's cousin until they could get on their feet. At that time, Dallas was exploding in size, so construction and carpentry jobs were plentiful. Dean went right to work building cabinets while Tina stayed home with Holly. Eventually, they were able to get a place of their own, though there were some lean times in there. Dean's job wasn't always steady. It was on an as-needed basis, and things would get really tight during the times he wasn't needed. But from what they reported back to family, they were happy in Texas. But within a few months of their move, Dean and Tina stopped contacting their family in Florida. Many sources say that the last contact was in October of 1980, but the Texas Observer reported that Tina did send a Christmas card to her family, which included a recent picture of Holly, and that may have been sent a little later, possibly November or December. From what we learn later, this card probably did come more like November than December. It was in December of 1980 that Dean's mother, Donna, got a call from someone claiming to have found Donna's car that she had loaned to Tina and Dean. This man was in Los Angeles, and he said he was going to arrange to have the car returned to Florida for her. When a time was arranged to get the car, it was strange. The people who brought the car to Florida wanted to meet at midnight at the Daytona Speedway. When the family got there, they were met by 3 women wearing long robes, and only one of them spoke. She said her name was Sister Susan. She said she wanted to return this car to the family, but it was in exchange for a donation, of course. Hearing from someone with a name like Sister Susan wasn't entirely out of the norm for the family. Dean had dabbled in various groups that grew from the Jesus People movement, more commonly known as the Jesus Freaks, of the 1970s. Like other religious movements of the time, it came from those who had been inspired by the hippie counterculture, the peace-loving movement, but they didn't find the answers they were looking for in either the free love side of things or drug use or both. They were looking for something that encompassed all of the peaceful side without all those other things. And some found this by turning to religion. Not all of these religions were based in Christianity. The Hare Krishna are a good example, as many of their early American members were ex-hippies. Dean was more interested in the Christian groups, particularly the Jesus People movement. When he was 17 and 18, his mom would come home and find men in robes sitting at the table. But Dean's interest in this declined as his relationship with Tina became more serious. But with Sister Susan and other robed women around, it looked like Dean may have gotten back into some type of religious group. And that was what Sister Susan said happened. Dean and Tina were now members of their group and wanted the family to know that they were fine. But they were cutting off contact with anyone outside of the faith, and that included their family. Sister Susan then had the gall to ask Donna for a $1,000 donation to get her car back. According to the Washington Post, the police had been alerted to the meeting and Sister Susan was taken into custody, though the police report about this has not been located as far as I know. It's not clear why they took Sister Susan into custody, maybe on suspicion of theft of the vehicle, but she was not held for long and did not go through any formal charges. At first, the family reluctantly accepted Sister Susan's story that the family had joined this religious group due to Dean's history dabbling with those types of organizations. And also Tina's sweet and trusting nature and her relatively young age would have also made her susceptible to a group like this. Frankly, it sounded like something they might do. But as time passed, it just didn't seem to sit right with Dean and Tina's parents. There's a difference between joining a church and joining a church that makes you cut off all contact with everyone you know. The first thing could have happened, but the second seemed wrong and out of character, especially as time passed. So Dean's mother, Donna, went to the police to report 22-year-old Dean, 18-year-old Tina, and the 1-year-old Holly missing, and she gave Louisville, Texas as their last known location. Donna told the police everything she knew, including the return of the car and the meeting with Sister Susan, and the police essentially told her that adults who choose to cut off contact with their family aren't missing people. Maybe they were in a cult, but that wasn't, as of yet, a police matter. So the parents were left to search for themselves. Though they couldn't get the police to see the family as missing people, they were able to get them listed with the Salvation Army. Now, I didn't know this, but the Salvation Army has their own family reunification program that they've been running since the late 1800s. Their goal is to bring together families who have lost touch with each other. But though the Salvation Army's Missing Persons program did actively search for the family, no solid leads about Dean, Tina, or Holly ever came to light. From 1980 until 2020, the families had no idea what happened. And then, investigative genetic genealogy solved the case. Back in January of 1981, a man let his German Shepherd off leash in a wooded area in northeast Harris County, Texas, which is near Houston. The dog ran off and then came back with a human arm. The man called the police, who then searched the area, but they didn't find anything else. A week later, the same dog went out to this same area, and this time he came back with a hand. An even more thorough search was launched, and on Monday, January 12th, 1981, 2 bodies were found just about 100 feet off the road. At first, the authorities couldn't even tell gender due to the state of the remains, but it was later determined that they were male and female. They had been in the woods for at least 2 weeks and up to a few months. A pair of green gym shorts and a bloody towel were found near their bodies. It was determined that the couple had been murdered. The woman had been strangled and the man had been beaten to death. Reconstructions of their faces were made and their ages were young. The female was between 15 and 20 and the male was 18 to 25. Early investigative speculation was that the woman had been attacked and the man likely tried to defend her, which then turned the attacker or attackers on him. Though Tina and Dean's families tried to report them missing, the police wouldn't take the report, so they were not considered when the investigators were looking at missing persons reports in the area. When they were not identified, they were both buried and then known as the Harris County Does. In July of 2011, a cold case investigation took on the case of the Harris County does, and they were both exhumed to get DNA samples. This was funded thanks to a grant from the National Institute of Justice to do DNA testing on unidentified murder victims, of which there were several in Harris County. Among them were victims of serial killer Dean Corll. As of this recording, only one set of remains from the Dean Corll case remain unidentified, and that case is being actively worked on. The DNA of the Harris County does was entered into a national database, though they didn't expect to get a hit. The bodies had been found in early 1981, long before people's DNA was being collected into law enforcement databases. So even if one of them did have a criminal record, DNA wouldn't have been taken. But it was there ready to be used when they could use it. And they could in 2020 when they stopped trying to make a direct DNA match and instead tried to make a familial match. Identifinder International took the case and began building out the victims' family trees. They had 2 genealogists working on the case, one working on the male doe and one working on the female. The idea was that since they were found together, identifying one would get them to the other. And this worked. They were first able to find a family tree for the male doe that led them to a family with the last name Clouse out of Kentucky. These were cousins of the male victim. They then learned that the family line had moved to Florida and they were starting to get very close. They narrowed in on one line of the family tree through DNA, but then it was time to do some detective work. They called a woman named Debbie Brooks to ask her if she had a family member go missing in the early 1980s. Debbie was Dean's sister. When Debbie told them that her brother had been missing for a long time, they broke the news to her that they believed his body had been found back in 1981. Debbie mentioned that Dean's wife had gone missing at the same time and that her name was Tina. And so they told her that a woman's body had been found with Dean. So then Debbie asked the next logical question in her mind, what about the baby? To which the genealogist asked, what baby? Holly, who would have been 1 around the time the bodies were found, was still missing. She was not found with her parents' bodies, so they did a search for any infant and child doe cases that might match the timing and the circumstances, but they found none. There was always the possibility that Holly's body had been near her parents, but being smaller, it may have been taken by animals. But so long as her body hadn't been found, the family did have hope that she may still be alive and they would get to meet her one day. And that is exactly what happened. Thanks to the same people who gave Tina and Dean their names back, those genealogists from Identifinders set up a team to start looking for Holly, and they called it the Hope for Holly DNA Project. They had a lot more specific information this time around. They knew where she was born, where she went missing from, her exact age, an age progression from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was generated, and they had her parents' DNA. They used the momentum from Dean and Tina's identifications to get a lot of media coverage, and a lot of information was released to the public. Family members uploaded their DNA to genealogy sites with the thought that if she was out there somewhere and had been adopted, she might use a DNA kit to try to find her birth family, and they would be ready to find her if that happened. The Texas Attorney General's Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit also investigated this as a missing child case. They figured if they could find out what happened to Holly, it might give them a clue as to who killed Tina and Dean. They sent a request to Florida to get a copy of Holly's birth certificate, which is a pretty standard records request, except it was denied. Holly's birth certificate had been sealed and was only available even to law enforcement through a court order. Now, this only happens in very specific circumstances, and one of those circumstances was adoption. The hope that Holly would be found alive went through the roof, and if this adoption was done legally, as it seemed like it was, That would get them a lot more information as long as they could get everything unsealed. That would take probable cause, and it's definitely something that the Texas authorities thought they had now that Holly was officially a missing person and her parents had been identified as murder victims. A judge agreed with them and unsealed all the documents, which included the adoption records. Holly had been adopted in Arizona, and her parents were a pastor named Philip and his wife, Constance. By this point, Holly was in her 40s and a mother to 5 children. She and her adoptive father, Philip, were both living in Oklahoma, so the police went out there to interview them. They approached Holly while she was at work at a deli. They told her that they were investigating a cold case, a young couple who were murdered 40 years before, and they told her that their baby went missing, and they believed she was that baby. They also told her that Dean and Tina's families had been looking for her for a long, long time. Holly had always known she was adopted and had been told that her birth parents couldn't raise her due to their religious beliefs. At the same time they were talking to Holly and she was processing all of this information, the police were also interviewing Philip separately at his home about how exactly he came to adopt Holly. He told People magazine that he told them the story, but the investigators kept pushing with harder questions. And then it occurred to him that they considered him to be a possible suspect in Tina and Dean's murders, but he has been cleared of all involvement. Philip said it was in early November 1980 when he heard a knock at the back door of the church where he was head pastor. He saw 2 women dressed in white robes, and he assumed they were there to ask for food or something like that. Instead, one of them held out Holly. Philip first asked if they were needing a babysitter, but then they said they wanted to give the baby away. They lived a nomadic lifestyle that separated men and women, and raising a baby just did not fit into their religious culture. They said they were going to give the baby away whether he took her or not, and worried for the baby's safety, he took her. They left him with Holly's birth certificate and a note relinquishing Tina and Dean's parental rights. Philip and his wife then went through the legal channels to formally adopt her. It is believed that Tina was one of the women who handed Holly to Philip that day. In piecing together the evidence, the investigators believe that Dean and Tina had voluntarily joined the Christ Family group / cult while in Texas, and they were on their way to Blythe, California, where the group had a winter camp. This group was led by a man who went by Jesus Christ Lightning Amen, but was more commonly known as Charles McHugh. And according to cult expert Rick Ross, this was one of the most destructive cults at the time, as Lightning Amen would separate families. He felt that children were just kind of baggage and a distraction for the followers who he wanted full loyalty from. Therefore, children, if they were born, had to go. The members were completely cut off from the outside world, and McHugh was an abusive leader. He was psychologically abusive, he used drugs to control people, and he eventually went to jail for possessing and transporting meth. The cult mostly broke up in the late 80s after he went to prison, and he died in 2010. The police do not know how long Tina and Harold were in Arizona or how their bodies ended up back in Texas. Investigators think it's possible that the couple left the group or at least tried to leave. They are actively looking for information on Christ Family follower Rosemary Garcia. She seems to be deceased at this point, but she may have been with Tina the day Holly was left at the church and may have more information. She did have 3 daughters who were teenagers at the time. Their names were Jill, Joy, and Jan, or at least those were the names they were going by. And they may know something, so they're also asking for any information on them. So far, several former members of Christ Family have spoken with the police. Sister Susan has been identified, and ABC News reached out to her, and she said she did deliver the car, but she had no knowledge of any murder and that the group was committed to nonviolence. The investigators are keeping an open mind, and there does not seem to be any evidence that the murders were part of any group effort. It's possible that this was an individual within the group acting on their own. It's also possible that Dean and Tina regretted joining the group, particularly as they had to give up their daughter, and they were trying to hitchhike home to Florida when they crossed paths with the wrong person. As for Holly, Dean and Tina's families were relieved not just that Holly was alive, but that she had a happy life with her adoptive parents, and they were thrilled to meet her and build a relationship. After Holly was found, the Hope for Holly DNA Project became the Dean and Tina Lynn Clouse Memorial Fund. It funds additional DNA testing in other cases. Holly has recently published a memoir, and I'll leave a link to where you can buy it in the show notes. The Texas Attorney General's office asks that if anyone has tips, you can email their Cold Case and Missing Persons unit with tips about the Baby Holly case at babyhollytips@oag.texas.gov. And of course, I'll leave this email in the show notes along with where you can buy the book.